In Florida, there is an ant war happening inside a chicken barn, and the weapon that wins it is already in your kitchen cabinet. It is not vinegar. It is not cinnamon. It is a white powder that costs $4 at any grocery store, mixed with breakfast food and placed inside a plastic box with a single hole drilled in the side. That is it. 1 tablespoon of leftover bacon grease, half a tablespoon of that powder, and within 48 hours, an entire colony of ants will carry its own death sentence back to the queen. And the reason this works on a chicken farm, inside a pantry, under a refrigerator, in grass, in gravel, in the crack of a sidewalk, is not because the powder is a poison in the way you think of poison. It is because the powder turns the ant's own biology into a weapon against itself. And the biologist who explained exactly how that mechanism works told me something about the speed of death that changed every ratio I was about to mix. I went to Florida to meet a father who has been fighting ants on his homestead for 12 years. He learned the hard way that if you get the ratio wrong by even a teaspoon, the queen survives. His 8-year-old daughter, Cornbread, mixes the bait with him every Saturday, and the recipe starts with bacon. His name is Ben. He lives on 5 acres outside Ocala, and the ant problem started the day a summer thunderstorm drove a colony of big-headed ants under the floor of his chicken barn. He tried boiling water. The ants moved to the next stall. He tried diatomaceous earth. The ants walked right over it. He tried a store-bought spray and lost 3 chicks because nobody told him the residue stays toxic to birds for weeks. That was the moment Ben stopped trusting anything with a label he could not pronounce. He told me he walked back into his kitchen, pulled open the cabinet under the sink, and stared at a box of 20 mule Team Borax he had bought 2 years earlier for a laundry stain that never came out. And standing there in a barn that smelled like ammonia and wet hay, he remembered something his grandfather told him about a white powder that southern farmers used before chemical companies existed. The active ingredient is boric acid, a compound mined from the earth that has been killing insects since the 1800s. And here is the part nobody tells you. Boric acid does not kill an ant the way you think a poison kills something. It does not cause convulsions. It does not stop the heart. It does something far stranger. Once an ant ingests boric acid, the compound begins disrupting the enzymes in its digestive system and its nervous system. The ant does not die on contact. It walks back to the colony, grooms itself, and feeds the bait to every ant it meets through a mouth-to-mouth process called trophallaxis. Imagine a single forager turning into a walking delivery system, passing poison to the workers, the larvae, and finally, the queen. But the window between eating the bait and dying is the only thing that matters. If the ant dies too fast, the colony survives. If the poison is too weak, the colony feeds for free and keeps multiplying. The ratio that actually works is approximately 1 part boric acid to every 10 parts attractant. Push it to 1 in 5. And the forager drops dead on the trail before it ever reaches the nest. Drop it to 1 in 50, and you are running a soup kitchen for ants. Ben learned that ratio the hard way over 2 summers of trial and error. And the moment he finally got it right, the bait recipe itself came from a pan of Sunday breakfast. The morning Ben cracked the code. His daughter, Cornbread, had just turned 6. She was sitting on the kitchen counter in pajamas with flour on her nose because she had tried to flip a pancake herself and missed the pan entirely. Ben poured the leftover bacon grease from breakfast into a glass jar and stared at it. Bacon grease is animal fat, rendered into a golden liquid that smells like smoke and salt. To an ant that prefers protein over sugar, It is the most irresistible substance on earth. He measured 1 tablespoon of warm grease into a plastic cup. Then he added half a tablespoon of boric acid powder, 3 parts grease to 1 part powder, a ratio he had never seen on any pest control website. Most guides tell you to use a weak solution, 1 part boric acid to 10 parts sugar water, so the ants survive long enough to share the poison. But Ben had discovered something strange with protein baits. Ants will eat grease slower than syrup. They carry tiny globs back to the nest 1 trip at a time. If the poison is too diluted, they get full before the dose reaches the queen. So he pushed the ratio higher, and he prayed he had not just made a nest-strengthening free meal. Cornbread asked if she could stir it. Ben handed her a popsicle stick. She mixed the paste until it looked like peanut butter with tiny white crystals floating in it. They poured the mixture into 4 small plastic containers with lids, the kind you get at the deli counter. Ben drilled a single hole in each lid with a 1/4-inch bit, wide enough for an ant to pass through, but too small for a curious chicken beak or a rat's paw. He placed the stations along the ant trail that wound from the barn door to the feed room, and then he waited. The reason patience matters here is not about self-control. It is about how an ant colony operates. Inside every nest, thousands of worker ants live under the complete command of a single queen who never leaves the chamber. She can lay up to 800 eggs per day, and the only way to stop the colony is to kill her before she produces a replacement. Spraying the workers on the surface does nothing. They are expendable. You have to poison the queen through the food she eats, and she only eats what her workers feed her through trophallaxis. That mouth-to-mouth transfer is the entire strategy. Ben checked the bait stations the next morning. Nothing. He checked again that afternoon. Still nothing. Cornbread started calling them ghost traps, and Ben started wondering if he had killed the scent trail with his own boot prints. But on the morning of the 2nd day, he walked into the barn and froze. 2 of the 4 stations were covered in ants. Hundreds of big-headed ants swarming the lids, crawling in and out of the drilled holes, carrying microscopic beads of bacon grease and boric acid back toward the nest. The bait was working so aggressively that Ben could see a distinct line of ants moving in both directions, a river of foragers bringing the poison home. And then Cornbread asked a question that changed the entire project. She looked at the swarming bait station and said, "Daddy, what about the ants in Mrs. Dawson's kitchen?" Mrs. Dawson was a client who had called Ben 2 weeks earlier, frantic about tiny black ants crawling out of her microwave outlet onto the counter where she made sandwiches for her grandchildren. Ben had assumed the same bait would work, but the moment he set a grease station on her counter, the ants walked right past it. They were not interested, not at all. And that is when Ben learned something that every professional exterminator knows but no YouTube tutorial ever explains. Ants are not one problem. They are over 12,000 species, and the bait that destroys a colony of grease-eating big-headed ants will be completely ignored by a colony of sugar-craving ghost ants. You have to match the bait to the species. For the sweet ants, Ben needed a different recipe entirely. He needed honey, and the ratio had to be completely different. But before he could mix that new bait, he had to solve a problem he had never even considered. An ant bait that works can become a poison hazard for anything else that licks it. And in Mrs. Dawson's kitchen, that hazard had 4 paws and ate everything that hit the floor. Mrs. Dawson's dog, a golden retriever named Gus, had licked a spilled sugar ant bait off the floor the year before and spent 2 nights at the emergency vet. So when Ben walked into her kitchen with a jar of boric acid, she made him promise that whatever he placed on her counters would not send her dog back to the clinic. Ben understood the math better than most. Boric acid poisoning in dogs can begin at roughly 0.02 of an ounce per pound of body weight. For a 70-pound retriever, that threshold arrives fast, and the symptoms start with nausea and disorientation before cascading into cardiovascular and renal failure. The Environmental Protection Agency lists boric acid as an insecticide that should not be used around animals or children under 6. Open bowls of sweet poison sitting on a kitchen floor are exactly what the warning means. So Ben took a box of plastic drinking straws from Mrs. Dawson's pantry and cut them into 1-inch segments with a pair of kitchen shears. Then he mixed a new bait, 1 tablespoon of honey, warm enough to pour but not hot enough to degrade the active ingredient, a 1/4 teaspoon of boric acid. The ratio is critical, and it is completely different from the bacon grease formula. Sugar-feeding ants like ghost ants and odorous house ants consume bait rapidly because the sweetness triggers their carbohydrate hunger. If the poison is too strong, the workers die on the counter before they walk back to the nest. So you have to weaken the dose, giving them a full day of life after the meal. Enough time to feed the queen and the brood through trophallaxis. Ben loaded the honey mixture into a plastic syringe, filled each straw segment like a tiny sausage casing, and laid them on a sheet of wax paper to cool. The result was a sealed, mess-free bait station that could be wedged behind a microwave, slid under a toaster, or tucked into the corner of a pantry shelf, where no dog paw could ever reach. And if the homemade version was not enough, Ben had another tool. He pulled out a tube of Maxforce Fleet, a professional-grade gel bait laced with fipronil. The active ingredient works by disrupting the insect's central nervous system, and its speed is calibrated so the ant dies roughly 3 to 5 days after ingestion. That delay is the entire point. The forager collects the gel, carries it home, and feeds the colony through the same mouth-to-mouth transfer before the poison shuts down its body. Ben filled a separate set of straws with the Maxforce gel and placed both the honey sticks and the fipronil sticks along the ant trails in Mrs. Dawson's kitchen, targeting the seam behind the sink, the outlet cover near the microwave, and the dark gap under the pantry door. Then he went one step further. He pulled out a packet of Alpine WSG, a water-soluble granule insecticide containing 40% dinotefuran. It is a non-repellent, which means ants do not detect it and do not avoid it. They walk over the dried residue, pick up the chemical on their legs and bodies, and carry it back to the nest through grooming. And here is the detail that made Mrs. Dawson stop worrying about Gus. Alpine WSG is labeled safe for use in homes with children and pets. Once the application has dried, a fact confirmed in writing by the manufacturer, Ben mixed the granules in a pump sprayer at the moderate rate and applied a thin band under the refrigerator, along the baseboard behind the stove, and around the pipe penetrations under the kitchen sink. The liquid dried within 20 minutes into an invisible film that would remain active for 30 to 60 days. But while the indoor war was now fully armed, Ben still had a chicken barn to check. He drove back to the property alone the next morning. The sun was barely up, and the air inside the barn hung heavy with the smell of feed and wet wood. He walked to the first bait station. The lid was alive with ants, big-headed ants feeding so thickly that the plastic container looked like it was vibrating. He checked the second station. Same result. The third and fourth stations sat untouched, bone dry, not a single ant anywhere near them. Ben realized he had placed them too far from the main scent trail, on a section of concrete the ants had never touched. So he picked up one of the unused stations and moved it directly onto the active highway, right at the point where the ants were streaming from the barn wall toward the feed room. And then he waited. What he did not yet know is that a single swarming bait station means the foragers are feeding the queen. But whether the dose is high enough to kill her depends on something far stranger than poison. It depends on how often the queen eats, how many workers are sharing the load, and a biological quirk that makes some ant colonies nearly immortal. The biological quirk Ben had never heard of is called polygyny. Some ant colonies keep multiple queens alive in the same nest, each one laying eggs, each one a backup copy of the colony's genetic future. Kill one queen, and another steps forward before the workers even notice the original is dead. Big-headed ants, the species swarming his barn, almost never practice polygyny. A single queen rules the colony, and every egg laid inside that nest comes from her body alone. Ben's bacon grease bait had reached her through the mouth-to-mouth network, and the dose, pushed slightly higher than the standard recommendation, delivered enough boric acid to fatally disrupt her digestive enzymes. 3 days after he moved the unused station onto the active trail, he walked into the barn and the ants were gone. Not fewer ants, not a slower trail, gone. The bait stations sat empty, abandoned, a few dead workers scattered near the holes where they had exited and never made it back. The colony that had terrorized his chickens for 2 summers had collapsed completely. Its queen dead in the dark, her final brood unfed and dying in the nursery chamber. Across town, Mrs. Dawson called Ben 5 days after he placed the honey straws behind her microwave. She told him she had made a peanut butter sandwich and left it on the counter for 10 minutes while she answered the door. When she came back, not a single ant had found it. The straws were chewed down to empty casings. The Maxforce gel was streaked with foraging trails, and the Alpine WSG residue had stopped any new scouts from wandering in through the pipe gaps. Gus, the golden retriever, never touched a single bait, never sniffed a single straw, never needed a vet visit. Ben had solved her ant problem without a drop of open poison anywhere in the house. The total cost for both properties, the barn and the kitchen, came to less than $15 in boric acid, honey, straws, and a few bacon breakfasts that would have been cooked anyway. The Maxforce tube and the Alpine packet added another $22 and will last through a dozen future infestations. Ben now keeps a pre-mixed jar of grease bait in his barn fridge and a bag of cut straws in his truck. Cornbread calls it the ant candy factory. She stirs the batches on Saturday mornings before the bacon even hits the pan, and she can tell you the ratio by heart. 1 tablespoon of grease, half a tablespoon of boric acid, protein ants. 1 tablespoon of honey, 1/4 teaspoon of boric acid, sugar ants. The numbers are simple enough that an 8-year-old remembers them better than most adults. And here is the detail that Ben only learned after the barn was clean, after Mrs. Dawson's kitchen was silent, after the war was over. The boric acid he bought at a grocery store for $4 a box is the exact same active compound used in half the commercial ant baits on the market, just sold under a brand name at 10 times the price. He was not inventing a new weapon. He was cutting out the marketing department. The recipe worked because the ants do not care about packaging or patents. They care about calories and survival, and they will carry both into the colony mouthful by mouthful until the queen is dead and the nest is empty. That is how a simple trick kills them all. The funny thing is, Ben never set out to become an ant expert. He just wanted his chickens to stop pacing the coop and his client to stop finding ants in her sugar bowl. The knowledge he rediscovered was never hidden. It is sitting in the laundry aisle of every supermarket in America, printed on a box nobody reads for $4. The same compound that chemical companies patent and rebrand and mark up by a factor of 10 is the same white powder that was mining out of the ground in Turkey and California before the combustion engine existed. And when you understand how it actually works, not as a spray that kills on contact, but as a Trojan horse that the ants deliver to their own queen, you realize that the entire pest control industry is built on selling you a more expensive version of something you already own. The question is not whether boric acid works. The question is why nobody told you the ratio until today. If you have a recipe that has worked on your property, drop it in the comments. I read every single one, and what you share might be the exact solution someone else has been searching for. Hit subscribe so you do not miss the next one. And if this kind of simple ground-level knowledge made sense to you, there is something waiting for you through the link in the first pinned comment. I will see you in the next video.